If you want to skip this intro and get straight to the structured presentation of ideas, click ahead to the time indicated. For now, though, a couple minutes of context. The purpose of this video will be to arrive at Jordan Peterson's worldview, or more specifically at the starting point of it, in a manner which will hopefully appeal more to my many skeptical friends, my friends who are more secular, more rationalist, less religiously inclined. I'm not seeking to speak on the bulk of Peterson's actual content so much as the foundation from which he starts. Much of what he says exists within a paradigm which must be embraced or understood a priori to some degree, in order to appreciate his meaning, or at least in order to not be bothered by his overtly religious language. Now, he does intro a lot of his talks by advocating this a priori paradigm. I think confusion often stems, though, from the fact that this intro is usually somewhat brief, and couched in much of the language or associations he's still kind of developing towards, he still needs to establish, and this is compounded by the sort of audience he has, and the sorts of things they already resonate with or give him positive feedback on. So I think arriving at Peterson's paradigm via other means might be useful for those of us who are more skeptical or who are more concerned particularly with the dogma of religion, with the harm that it causes. Okay, if we were to classify Peterson's worldview in philosophical terms, I think it would be something like an existentialist paradigm, with heavy influence from phenomenological or pragmatist lines of thought. One of the reasons Peterson is so controversial is he's very intersubjective. He makes all these attempts, in my view, creative and useful attempts, to converge religion and philosophy, psychology and neuroscience, mythology, evolutionary biology. He attempts to wrap all those up in the sort of common language many different minds, many different sorts of minds can understand. That's sort of by definition what makes someone have mainstream appeal. I think he's playing a valuable role, and I think he's nowhere close to done. But I have yet to feel reassured about the direction he's going. Recent years have seen some very stark changes with his devastating illness and his transition to the Daily Wire, his increasing merge with the political, an increased sort of irritability. I do understand and even share a great portion of the frustration with him, but I still think he offers a lot of value. It's my hope that if we can get his fundamentalist supporters to admit what his views really seem to be, and his dedicated critics to admit what his views really seem to be, we can return to a place of more open-minded dialogue where we, or even he, might feel open again to more controversial conversations, where we might reframe some of his message in his older language.
That's Marduk. So the story of Marduk, I'll just give it to you very briefly. Tiamat and Apsu are locked in embrace at the beginning of time. Goddess of salt water, god of fresh water, together. Chaos and order, right? They give rise, masculine and feminine, they give rise to the world of the elder gods. And those are, to me, they're primordial motivational forces. They're something like that. And their rage and their lust and their love and all these things that possess us that are there forever. And they're out in the world acting. And they carelessly slay Apsu, their father. Rat is this. The rats are all like this. The rat goes like this. So the rat's like this. The normal rat is like this. That's the normal rat. You are now a normal rat. Holes in it. And you can see through the holes in the curtain. But the curtain is your construction. So the curtain with the holes determines what you see. Well, Boss would say, no, it's the opposite in a very strange thing. It's that the meaning of the world manifests itself to you more or less of its own accord. And
back when it was more flexible, when it appealed to other religions, excuse me, and worldviews, when he discussed philosophers and psychoanalysts. So, the original version of this intro had a long rambly piece on what is philosophy and problems of elitism and language games, and then of course I had to caveat it all by acknowledging that I'm not a philosopher and that it's kind of lame to accuse elitism when you yourself haven't done the work to speak authoritatively on it. I scrapped the caveat and rambling intro though, because this has already been long enough, and I want to get to the meat of the video. The basic point though was I will use certain things wrong. I even got an idea wrong once. But I don't claim Peterson's a philosopher, and he doesn't claim he's a philosopher. The truth is, there are many more useful forms of thought than pure philosophy. It's also notable that many philosophers have believed absolutely insane things, almost all of them. They tend to be quite stupid in particular areas. Half the great ones seem to have killed themselves. They were either obsessed with women or were miserable misanthropes, often both. Rousseau abandoned his children while writing about how to educate children. Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. If we're getting into scientists, Tesla was in love with a pigeon and believed he was receiving messages from Mars. Oppenheimer attempted to poison his tutor. He strangled people. He dropped suitcases on them from bridges, hoping in sudden spurts of madness to kill them, and more. All of them were promiscuous. Newton spent more time on alchemy in the Bible than on physics. Although alchemy has some secrets, we'll get into that later, secret wisdoms. Diogenes preached extreme simplicity, yet was himself the son of a wealthy man, probably, was a beneficiary of patrons, and begged for food from working people. Seneca wrote about the virtues of poverty while he himself was wealthy. Socrates' entire method relied on insisting he knew nothing, while showing he knew more, just with this kind of sneaky conversational trick, which allowed him to never be debunked because he was asking only questions. Very clever. And if you want to look at more modern forms of thought, our very own Roger Penrose believes consciousness arises from something like collapsing tubules in the brain, and that the universe is a never-ending chain of heat-death leading to singularity, leading to Big Bang. Insane or brilliant? In Penrose's case, the math led him to this conclusion. Unfortunately, though, the further you get into the soft sciences, the less you can construct a model with math, and the more you have to construct with hazy things like order and chaos and the religious mode of being, and that's what God is, technically. This is where you discuss suffering, meaning, good and evil, and all such things, as they appear to the human within the human brain. So that's basically the argument of this video. Actually, I could probably end it there, but I want to develop this in a slightly more rigorous way. This is a long one, so buckle up. I'd also like to note that this is very much a working presentation of ideas, so I would love critique. I've pinned a Google Doc in the comments, which is open to suggestions. So, what is Peterson's existentio-phenomenalo-pragmatist paradigm? Part 1. Perception is preconditional. There is a world. You are in it. You are suddenly awake, experiencing. Things suggest themselves to you unconsidered. Things like trees, rocks, cold, light, hands, even beauty, identity, memory. We view some things as more abstract, but they may actually be some of the most primary things. Whatever the case, the set of these things leaps out at you unconsidered. It's shaped by a structure of perception which exists preconditional to the things themselves. It exists preconditional to any feeling, any reason, or any self-investigation. We could call this structure the perceptual structure, or just biology. The important thing to understand about it is it's not like other things. At this level, the perceptual structure ceases to be something we do and becomes instead the very structure by which we exist. We have a human-shaped existence. As far as we are concerned, existence is human-shaped. You could say that any and every description of existence that is meaningful, to the degree that it is meaningful, will presuppose this human shape. That's a big claim, but we're going to get there. Part of this human shape is language. We are structured such that a very fundamental part of our being lies in the discussion of that being, in seeing it in some sense from above or from outside, regarding it, in developing distinct terms by which to describe it, and to comprehend those terms when used by others. Consider someone describing a guitar concert, maybe the moment a guitar string snaps and slashes across the performer's wrist, and the entire room goes still, and a drop of ruby blood drips from the wrist onto the strings, onto the floor. If someone is describing this scene or this experience to us, in our own heads we can receive, or rather generate, the essence of what is being communicated, and what is being communicated is the meaning of what went on at the concert. Depending on the language you use, you may be trying to communicate a sense of tragedy about the experience, or awe, or you may be communicating something regarding the quality of a certain brand of guitar string, or the style of this particular guitar player. Note also that the language you use includes things like tone, facial expressions, emojis, shared cultural memories and references, and so on. So there's a human shape to this conversation and the meaning that arises from it. And a massive part of this shape is the language we use, a massive part of what constrains it, which comes with these strange abstracting, regarding, simulating brains that develop symbols and then pass them around as sort of vehicles of meaning. But the meaning isn't really writing on the words of language. The meaning is made in the mind. It's in the potential of the mind. The words are, uniquely shaped triggers which facilitate that meaning making. I don't know. The point is, this is in the mind. The meaning doesn't write on the language itself. Okay, next. The language we develop seems to represent a spectrum from concrete to abstract. At the more concrete end of the spectrum, we have terms like hands and green and bridge. Then there are more nebulous or abstract terms like language and tool and identity. But even these supposedly nebulous things leap out as self-evident, well before a purely rational inquiry. They exist on a plane that's entirely more inherent to the human. We've only now begun to interrogate these things more surgically via science and rationality. Especially since the emergence of Enlightenment thought and the scientific method, this has been our practice, to break things down into variables, to identify cause and effect, and to build models that can faithfully predict. This works very well for things like molecules and building bridges, because these are the realm of hard science. This human-structured perception we have been speaking about does not enter into the functioning, or say the essence of the bridge. We might say that hard science is mechanistic. The soft sciences are fuzzier. But the scientific method proves useful here as well. For example, if you model enough of the reported experiences and associations surrounding a concept like identity, you can build a useful predictive model. You can experiment with how to shape it. Now, the variables in this case are much more difficult to discuss than those in the hard sciences. You could look at a brain in terms of particles or neurons, but first of all, we don't have the infinite computing power needed, and second of all, a description of particles doesn't actually convey what identity is in essence. Identity is an experience, a memory of experience, a story we tell ourselves using language and concepts and expectations that are tangled up in all the landscape of our socialization. Identity is very fuzzy. It's a thing that's related to by a mind that is not at its core a mathematical machine. Note here the distinction between brain and mind. We might posit that the brain is pure machine. This is fine. Everything it produces in consciousness is determined by mechanistic processes. Fine. But we need another term for the non-mechanical essence of things as perceived by consciousness. This is the distinction between mind and brain. Your identity doesn't exist in your brain, it exists in your mind. Just as a story does not exist in the words on a page, the story exists in your mind. Just as music does not exist in mathematical intervals or sheet music or vibrations in the air, it exists in your mind. So the soft sciences come along and try to find language that bridges the gaps between this moment-to-moment sensation of identity and the actual causal hard science factors. So we use terms like childhood trauma or attachment disorder or narcissism, and they provide a sort of bridge from the broad narrative perception to the hard, immediate causality that cannot actually be experienced or observed directly. On a simple level, we could say you cannot develop the healthier brain habits without regarding the brain from outside, both in the laboratory sense, but then also in the narrative or perceptual sense. You cannot observe your neurological trauma response without the conceptual or narrative tools. But it's not only that, it's that the conceptual or narrative tools are this preconditional structure that shapes perception. They're not just tools like a screwdriver or even a hand or a color. No, the tools in this case are built into the shape of the mind. They are the sort of brain that uses a hand. They are the sort of brain that uses colors. Without this human-shaped existence, your brain would perceive no hand-related dimension in the world. It would perceive no color-related dimension in the world, and so on. You have to identify the human shape to your experience because that human shape is what leaps out preconditional to thought. Whereas the laboratory shape of things is never directly accessible. Even, or especially, from the skeptic's perspective, we might say that perception is the only directly verifiable or knowable thing. Bertrand Russell used the distinction knowledge by description versus knowledge by acquaintance. To be acquainted with something for him was to be directly aware of it. This is obviously a big part of this video, but I do want to sort of move through it all and roll towards a more tangible framing of religion, meaning Jordan Peterson, and so on. I want to explore the nature of description in language, but more in essence and less in semantics. So for now, I won't go into acquaintance, knowledge, verificationism, foundationalism, all the terms, etc. The hope is we can sort of just wake up, look around, and realize that what we perceive or are aware of is the most undeniable thing. This will lead us to what I call embodied knowledge, but we're not there yet. For now, we can simply call this perception or the phenomenological. For my purposes, the phenomenological is this human-shaped dimension to existence. It's not the things seen, but is the shape itself of our regarding. My suggestion here will be this: any description which refuses to acknowledge this becomes definitionally meaningless. This is what we will explore in the next section. Part 2. Logical Tautologies. The thesis of this section is something like, we can arrive at logical tautologies which also seem self-evident, but they are entirely abstract, disembodied. They are not the root of being, but are instead an abstraction. Consider the law of non-contradiction, or the law of identity. P equals P. The meaning of this statement is entirely self-referential. It's based entirely on its own internal definitions, completely disconnected from anything about which we can disagree, until it is snapped down into some sort of acting body that is doing something with those tautological assertions, something like reasoning or extrapolating regarding direct experience or other associations. Consider a statement such as the following: what I experience and refer to as melodious music is indeed what I mean, what I intend to mean when I say melodious. This is the sort of statement a theist might push a materialist towards by questioning the materialist's ability to reason or to value or to rely on any sort of mind-dependent terms, I guess, or realities. I don't know if that was stated very well. You can see this most directly in debates with the super annoying apologists like Andrew Wilson, Matt Slick, Cy 10.
Okay, the question is, how can a brain produce logic?
How's a brain restricted to physical laws of chemistry and physics? I'm just going to use motion, matter, chemistry, physics. How does that produce proper logical inference? As you said, which I think is very interesting, is not dependent upon the human brain. I totally agree with you. Well, then that means your brain, my brain are different brains. We can't use your brain or my brain to be the standards of logical inference. We can't. We both agree. We both make mistakes. We're both not perfect in our logical thinking.
What do we point to?
We apply to something else these laws of logic. Now,
but it sort of infuses the arguments as well of William Lane Craig and John Lennox, Cliff Neckley, even C.S. Lewis and Alvin Plantinga. They'll ask things like, how could a bubbling chemical soup produce rational inquiry leading to justified belief, much less value or objective value found in that belief? And when pushed to this, oftentimes the atheist debater might say something also very Andrew Wilson-esque, like, oh, I'm just performing an internal critique. I'm pointing out the incoherencies of your conception of God. I don't need to explain value in my terms yet. The two are unrelated. Or the atheist can grant some ground for the purpose of conversation and say something very solipsistic and skeptical, like I said above, the being that I experience as myself, when perceiving this thing that it calls music, experiences sensations that it calls melodious, and blah, blah, blah. Now, do you agree that that's likely to be what we're discussing, both in your mind and mind, when we both use this word? And it shifts the attention back to the language. You add a ton of qualifiers, but you still make the exact same arguments for or against theism, whatever, and you appeal to the only coherent frame in which those arguments can be made, the frame of direct embodied experience and extrapolation from that. Language or symbol are revealed once again to be tools helping identify and transmit parts of what's going on, but the symbols are completely irrefutable in and of themselves. They're simply symbols. They're just this self-referential grammar type thing, until you acknowledge that the words do not fulfill themselves by definition alone. Man does not live by bread alone. You must acknowledge the essence of the being I, the essence of experiencing something melodious, and the fact that you can mean something by making this statement. Once you affirm all these things, you've attached an actual meaning to the word melodious, and thus equipped yourself to meaningly agree or disagree with this description. This is where we encounter the limits of strictly scientific or materialist or reductionist thinking. There's nuance and potential disagreement with any single term I'd commit myself to here, but let's call it materialism for now. We have materialism versus phenomenology. The issue the phenomenological types had with materialism is it seems to have the attitude that in dissecting further and further and further, it will arrive eventually at some perfectly self-grounding description there at the bottom of all inquiry. Maybe if we look at it with maximal reason, we'll arrive at a sort of static, perfect truth. In pursuit of this, we meddle endlessly with our definitions. We think maybe we can define I instead as this being that I experience as myself, and then further, this bundle of sensations and impulses that is me, this array of particles that is a brain state. When vibrations pass through the ear canal and strike these three bones in my ear, and when all these little hairs vibrate this way, and these neurons fire, and so on, down to a description of melodiousness, of the experience of melodiousness. But we're caught. Once again, we're always caught. You must affirm experience. You can describe every particle to perfect mathematical precision, yet these supposed truths of science are only meaningful once we simply accept the phenomenological as brute fact, as this base, undeniable reality. This is where I think Peterson and Harris find a lot of common ground.
If you get the assumptions wrong, or even if you leave them incomplete, you're going to pay a big price for it. And the assumptions that we use in our culture, although they've enabled us to develop a tremendously potent technology, are incomplete in ways that have also cost us and that are extremely dangerous. And since the scientific age began, we've lived in a universe where the bottom strata of reality is considered to be something that's dead, like dirt. It's matter. It's objective. It's external. And there isn't any element of it that lends any reality to phenomena like meaning or purpose. That's all been relegated to the subjective and in some ways to the illusory. There are other ways of looking at what's real.
Yeah, but it all seems to sort of translate into terms of preference here.
But see, you're using the word preference as though it really took the air out of the balloon. What does it mean to say that you have a preference for not spending every conscious moment, you and everyone you love, and everyone who you might come to love, spending every conscious moment now and through any possible future, the longest possible future, perhaps a future that we could engineer to be much far longer than is naturally possible now, not suffering the worst possible misery?
I think it literally just means that I would be happier in the knowledge that that wasn't happening.
Well, it's not happier in the knowledge. It's,
it is in the knowledge when you're talking about other people. But even technically for me, like if I can't suffer without knowing I suffer. But okay, I said that as a technicality because if all of my friends were being tortured, but I was just being lied to about it, you know, I just didn't know, then of course I'm not going to be any more upset for that. That's just a sort of technicality that I'm making. But presuming that I'm correct about what I know about the world, like you're asking, what does it mean for me to say that I would prefer not to just suffer immeasurably for the rest of time? What it means is that I would be happier if that didn't happen, if that weren't the case. I think that is literally just what...
Well, that's circular because happier means imports the notion of preference on your account too.
Perhaps.
But for me, this isn't a problem
all
because
definitions are circular to a degree.
It's a brute fact about conscious systems. Because first of all, everything is happening in and as consciousness, right? I mean, there's no, like, so consciousness, you know, on my account is the one thing in this universe that can't be an illusion, right? Because to say that it might be an illusion is to invoke consciousness just as fully as any veridical impression does. I mean, like to say that this is all hallucination is only the way things seem. Well, it's the fact of seeming. It announces the truth of consciousness as much as anything else, right? So it could be a simulation, this could be a dream, I could be a brain in a vat. None of that actually undercuts the reality of consciousness as I'm defining it and as I believe everyone's experiencing it. So there's nothing, I mean, if you're going to keep pushing this analysis further and further and depriving our terms of the gravitas they seem to have in ordinary language games, you are going to wind up with something like a radical, mystical skepticism that privileges consciousness first above everything else.
Part 3. We require a language of the phenomenological. Let's consider when Peterson says the world is made of meaning. We could interrogate what that is supposed to mean from a range of positions, but we might also simply cut to the chase and ask ourselves, what can we offer when asked to describe reality? We can stretch and finagle to formulate every variety of description using all these different language games, but in the end, it seems like every description we consider will be composed, to me it seems, of either A, these logical tautologies, which are simply arrangements of entirely self-referential symbols, or B, it will appeal to direct embodied phenomenology. Information comes in via our perceptual apparatus, and we transmute it into something of an entirely different essence. Red, music, whimsy, identity, these are not arrangements of points in a field. They are not matter. They are experiences. They cannot be mathematically described. This meaning is not some miraculous woo-woo spark, injecting some random essence or divinity into the natural process in an anti-scientific sense. That's not the game these words are playing. That's not their true alignment. The sorts of arguments which do suggest some woo-woo element, like the arguments of religious fundamentalists say, are ironically arguments made from a purely rationalistic place. They attempt to give a thing the sense of rigid objectness which strips it of its spirit. Peterson mentioned this in his talk with Alex.
But did it really happen?
Well, which parts of it?
Even if they're not expressing it very well, like
what they're getting at there is they're trying to emphasize the historicity. They're trying to say, yeah, but did it historically happen? Probably is what they mean by the word really there.
Right. But the thing is, it speaks of their, see, they have the problem is that Christians who ask that have a metaphysics that's not Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a non-starter, the question. It's like, you're asking me the question a materialist atheist would ask. And you want me to give you an answer that bolsters your faith, but the presumptions of your question are Enlightenment atheistic.
No. We have established that our starting point must include the language of the phenomenological in order to acknowledge what the phenomenological is. I see Peterson as representing a sort of tension between the theist and the atheist here. To the theist, the primacy of the phenomenological is dangerous because it is mind-dependent, aka subjective. To the atheist, the primacy of the phenomenological is dangerous because it is the only form of direct knowledge. Even further, when confronted by the dread of scientific thought, the existentialists and phenomenologists suggest that this direct knowledge is self-evidently meaningful. Again, the aim is not to pose an irrational description. It is to observe what reason can encompass and what it cannot. Reason is just a tool of regarding. Reason provides a description of a perceiver's position in relation to a system. Those systems which are more intuitive or more under the power of the perceiver will be seen as causally prior in some way, and as belonging therefore to a more grounded layer of a reasoning. But if there's no perceiver at the very bottom to distinguish relations, there's no meaning by which to reason at all. Part 4. Getting beyond language. The issue is that because of our evolved biology, we think the world can be construed as a set of things, material, dead things, just sort of bumping into one another. This is very useful for certain things, but it leads to the sorts of descriptions which tear the body and its being further and further from the discussion, until you're left discussing nothing but the rules themselves of discussion. Consider the philosophers of old, before we woke up to the tricks of our own mind. They were more concerned with the sort of knowledge you could live out. As we try to methodize, we risk distancing ourselves from this because method is, by definition, the sort of thing that is regarded from outside, rather than acted out. Perception, as the thing itself which structures experience and action, cannot all the time be discussed directly. Indeed, when we're regarding perception, we're doing what Sartre calls reflective consciousness. That is, we are perceiving perception. This betrays already a recognition of a still undeniable, still immutable perception underneath. We must acknowledge that perception is in essence not the sort of thing that can be discussed. To discuss music is not music. To write it is not music. To craft an instrument is not. No, music is music. It cannot be caught and held in any single moment or arrangement, because to catch and hold it is to kill it. In the same way, the phenomenological is the quality in which being is immersed, or the property by which, as which, being is engendered. You can start to see why the phenomenologists prefer the term being to others like reality or existence or the world. Consider a fungal consciousness, incapable of hearing sound. It would have no conception whatsoever of music. We cannot say that music is subjective to this creature. No, for this creature, music does not exist at all. We can only describe it tangentially, by analog, with the senses the creature does possess. We might describe music as an arrangement of textures or of lights or quantities. We might describe its mathematics with perfect precision, but we will not be describing music. Music for this creature does not exist. This becomes easier when you consider all the senses that we humans do not have. Think of an alien so wildly different from us as to possess none of our senses. Think of the senses it might have. We cannot. You cannot. You can only draw analogy to yours. For you, these senses do not exist. In a universe with no alien minds, these senses do not exist. In this same way, the whole of meaning would not exist without consciousness interfacing with matter in some way, via a sensory apparatus which transmutes mere material process into something phenomenological. In a universe without minds, meaning does not exist. This seems probably obvious. In some ways, it's as if I've only just now managed to claw my way up to where all the rest of people naturally function. Even, or maybe especially for an infant, the point I've just labored to establish is so fundamental as to not even need recognition. But therein lies the problem. As soon as we realize we can think, we start to confuse ourselves regarding what needs recognition. It's the duty of the critical mind to consider the sorts of meanings that seem natural and to doubt them. That's our job, to inspect the obvious. Just as it's difficult to imagine a set of senses outside sight and touch and hearing and all those, it's also difficult to imagine a set of meanings outside our human meanings. But because of the virtue of science and truth-seeking, we feel we ought to make an effort. We feel we can kind of undermine them in some very fundamental sense. But we trick ourselves because our brains are geared towards perceiving objects and using words, which must fly from the speaker's body and still retain their shape, to speak with other humans who are also not in the speaker's mind or body. This lends itself further towards the perception of static things moved around a landscape of potential which is either embraced or not embraced. This makes it difficult to describe being as a process, which makes it difficult to assert the primacy of direct experience while engaged in rational conversation. We need to honor the need for language which encompasses this side of being. If we want to avoid religious terms, fine, but consider words like divine and intuitive and spirit and agency. When we describe the religious, we're attempting to convey a state of being which regards something other so profoundly, so intensely, that our state of being abandons all self-regard. We're making our best attempt at describing those elements of being which are least conducive to description. They cannot be described, they can simply be suggested. Through description, we can guide or awaken ourselves to them, but we cannot actually convey them in description itself. Part 5. The Transcendent. How else to describe something that is most real yet least suited to language? If we hesitate to call it religious language, should we call it New Age? Should we call it the language of the poet? The transcendent language? The madman? The must we dance? Must we groan and wail? Must we simply run the mountaintops and shout our glory to the skies? How to discuss such a thing? It's noteworthy that an approach in this manner, from the perspective of a phenomenological philosophy, leads in many ways to the same sort of description our institutional religions already traditionally use. Let's consider how they describe the divine. They describe the divine as an objective ground for meaning. Yet we've been establishing that meaning, however real, arises only in the mind. The theist description then could be considered a trick of language, or it could be considered an observation, a surrender to the reality of embodied being. Clearly, this theist could frame this latter statement in reference to God. So then the theist appeals to a universal mind, a mind which kind of unites both matter and mind, which engenders all of matter and mind, the more fragmented forms of matter and mind that become, humans and planets and rocks and whatnot. More will need to be said on this. They also describe the divine as the embodiment of natural law. This description could be likened to a phenomenologist description. Reality is made up of consciousness nested in or inhabiting matter and material law. They describe the divine as ineffable, beyond human comprehension and certainly human language, yet they proceed to describe it through metaphor, poetry, paradox, much like phenomenologists attempting to describe raw experience. They describe the divine as both immanent and transcendent, present in all things yet beyond all things. This too mirrors the phenomenological observation that the mode of being or the structure of experience is nested in material law, yet of an entirely separate dimension. They describe the divine as eternal and unchanging, yet the heart of dynamism by which everything occurs and is experienced. This parallels so-called paradoxical descriptions of the fundamental structures that make up being, the manner in which nature seems to hold a constant and eternal structure, yet only ever manifest in finite material objects, the manner in which change is somehow the heart of all experience. They describe the divine as that which sweeps over and overtakes you, which can be recognized only in absolute surrender, yet also that which you must attend to and regard and make an effort towards through studying things like the Bible or theology or morality or whatever. In this way, the heart of being is processual or dialogical or relational. To the degree that a statement may seem paradoxical, this is because it will leave a hook, an unfinished end which can only be satisfied and then moving beyond to contradict or question it. For example, in affirming God's nature, we affirm the self. In affirming worship, we come into our own. In maintaining order, we prepare ourselves to greet chaos and create true newness from it. Sustained newness. In reaching towards chaos, we bring order into requirement. Perfect wisdom demands perfect ignorance. Enlightenment demands not knowing. Invulnerability is true power. In the constraint and narrowing of focus comes the true exercise of power towards an end, towards freedom, towards becoming, towards ultimate identity. These are not paradoxes. They're simply language's futile attempt to describe what cannot be described, but only lived and known directly. Over and over again, we see the same trend. Raw experience cannot be reduced, but for the sake of discussion, we must somehow try to regard it, compartmentalize, label it. Part 6. Observation alters reality. Or perhaps observation alters the states of mind, and therefore being, that are available to the observer. Consider how a utilitarian might replace a descriptor like virtuous with useful or util maximizing. This is fine, but only at a certain level. Then we need to swim back up to the everyday realm of conversation, pop our heads above water, and do whatever it is we're trying to do in a first-order sense. And focusing on that first-order sense will always entail a different perspective, a different set of sensations, different bodily or psychological involvement, a different sense of immersion or commitment. What Peterson, the existentialists, and religion observe is there are some truths or meanings that are only available once they're being acted out, and you cannot actually act them out while observing them in the skeptical or rational sense. Suppose I have Laplace's demon in my head, predicting the motion of every single particle or wave or whatever reality is made of. It can tell me what to do, and theoretically it should be able to maximize my happiness. Suppose I'm reclined on the couch in conversation with a lovely woman. Suppose there's a romantic vibe. She leans towards me. Were I to ask the demon what to do, what should he say? This kiss will result in net 7 utils for the world, so do it. At that moment, we've stepped out of the actual human structure, which makes our being, our motivation, our meaning. You could suppose we've sliced through flawed human perception in order to maximize experience, but you can also observe that we've eliminated the essence of what made the moment romantic. You could say we've eliminated the spirit of it. I'm no longer the same sort of being performing the same sort of meaningful act. The romantic is no longer instantiated in being. Thus, we see how a certain attitude of regarding, particularly an attitude which fixates on the rational delineation or description of things, can eliminate meaning by reducing direct immersion in the phenomenological. This is not to say the underlying processes are somehow less logical or mechanistic. It's simply to point out that the actual texture of being is engendered in this mind space. We're not flavoring it with mind or augmenting the underlying mechanics. No, being itself is irreducible to the mechanics. Indeed, to say the mechanics or natural law are underlying being is still misleading because it tempts us to view them as in some ways more fundamental or prior to mind or being. Due to everything we've been discussing, it's difficult to phrase this in a satisfactory way. The critic will point out, for example, that immersion and phenomenological are defined somewhat hazily. If the phenomenological is not a material thing, how can we say it's diminished when the mind focuses on one thing rather than another? Are we to describe the coming and going of certain intensities of sensation as if being itself is fluctuating in magnitude? Again, our argument is that it's a mistake to conceptualize the phenomenological as secondary or founded on some more fundamental thing. What we're discussing here is all that can be meaningfully discussed. We grow frustrated due to the futility of language and of the mind's attitude specifically towards language. It's not a futility of mind itself, but we reach a point, perhaps many paragraphs ago, where we must move on to avoid becoming redundant. We must simply accept the limitations of words and the ultimate futility of all description, and we must thunder ahead in the only manner by which discovery can actually come about. Consider this utilitarian couched beside a potential lover, considering whether he should kiss her. The possible utility of Laplace's demon in this case is obvious. He can inform you as to the likelihood of success, the happiness results, and so on. And of course, this is a rather alien scenario, so it seems more disturbing to us than many we face in the day-to-day. In many individual instances of ignorance, however, it seems very obvious to us that the strict science is incredibly useful. It's difficult to see where an increase in knowledge of this sort might be actually devastating. Go far enough down this path, though, and you change the actual structure of human interaction. This is where you get all the mad utilitarian thought experiments. This is where Nietzsche says the Christian is starving or denying aspects of human nature and therefore ends in resentment and weakness. Part 7. The Poet's Game. Consider the religious like poetry, or art, or humor. Actually, romance was a great example. It's in precisely the act of turning and interrogating it directly, scientifically, that the power of it is lost. It's precisely that part of us which evolved to motivate where rational description cannot. If we could build ourselves up again from the primordial soup, we could perhaps create a perfectly rational, perfectly efficient being that would require nothing of this dimension. But we are not this being, and this being would experience no meaning, certainly not this human-shaped meaning that is now our very essence. If we are not motivated, we are not active in the world. We are stagnant, dead. This is what Peterson means when he says science tears the meaning out of the world.
You perceive the meaning of the object. It's part of the perception. And you can't not see the meaning of the object. Well, you can, if you're a scientist, you can sort of separate out the object from its meaning. That's actually what science does. It tears the object away from its meaning. And then, of course, there's nothing meaningful left, and so science ends up value-free. But that's because the meaning has been torn out of it. Now, there's technical reasons for doing that, but Binswanger's point is, don't kid yourself. You see the meaning first. Here's an example.
This is what he means when he says there are embodied modes of being. They are infinitely more fundamental than external descriptions. The effort of phenomenological language, then, is actually to turn the attention away from the language. It's to slice beyond the cognized meaning of a word and get at something like the experience that just so happens to accompany the word. To the degree the mind stops to consider the definitions and all that, the mind seems to be withholding itself from the realm of truth. In this place of meta-regarding, attention is slid inexorably and increasingly towards the dead and rational space, from which we somehow start to doubt the nature of experience itself. We think ourselves to be doubting raw experience, when we're really simply doubting its mechanism or its description. The latter is entirely possible, the former is absolutely not. With this in mind, to notice the proper moments and engage the proper sort of focus is the religious mode of being. Again, this is the game of the poet, the singer, the performance artist. We will call this the poet's game. What the poet does is slice through the scientific concerns of causality and perfect preservation. Knowledge is affirmed instead by action here. This is where we give up the rigid, dissociated self regarding things from outside, and we step into a more resonant mode of being. Again, let's consider music. Suppose I play a key change from major to minor on the piano. Okay, while I wait for you to spiritually recover from the staggering quality of my phone recording, a word... So, as I was writing this, a lot of film scenes leapt into mind, and I kind of ended up going down this rabbit trail of looking for film scenes which most typify or capture this sort of embodied sense of meaning I'm discussing. So they were scenes that, relied heavily on music or poetry or visual, aesthetic imagery, in contrast to reason or kind of direct explanatory dialogue. This is obviously also tied somewhat to the whole thing writers talk about of show versus tell. Don't tell your audience what's going on, show them, make them feel it. And this is a big theme in all of art, probably, and in probably life. So, yeah, I had all these film scenes leaping to mind, and kind of went down this rabbit trail of compiling them and thinking about which ones would be best to include in the video. And then I ended up thinking, this is many minutes into the video. You'll notice, obviously, that I've been using less and less visuals as the video has gone on. And I'm going to start doing more short content, kind of random, spontaneous stuff as well. Probably specific, isolated scene analyses from books, from films, and that'll include music, probably mainly from the perspective of a writer, but also just generally, why is this scene so powerful? I love that stuff, and it's probably a little more mainstream, so I'm probably going to start doing some of that, and that'll be where most of those scenes I have compiled ended up, but I did put in a couple scenes here, and for me this one scene, which in particular very powerfully illustrates the point of embodied versus described knowledge and embodied versus described means of getting at meaning, because it's illustrated here not only in the major to minor music shift, but then also in the dialogue itself between these characters, the things they focus on. Notice where the power of the words stops, where it instead shifts the focus to other things which are sensory, which are remembered, which are embodied.
Soon, the orchards will be in blossom, and the birds will be nesting in the hazel thicket, and they'll be sowing the summer barley in the lower fields, and eating the first of the strawberries with cream. Do you remember the taste of strawberries?
Notice how the words are sort of encapsulated experiences. They're sort of reminders of what cannot be described.
Oh, Sam, I can't recall the taste of food. No, the sound of water. The touch of grass. Naked in the dark. There's nothing, no veil between me and the wheel of fire. I can see him with my waking eyes. Then let us be rid of it. once and for all. Come on, Mr. Frodo. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. Come on!
Again, suppose I play a key change from major to minor on the piano. It's only truly known as I am playing it, and as we are letting the experience strike us. But if I were to communicate it, the language best suited is not the language of mathematics. Oh yes, well you have a steel and copper wire under 170 pounds of tension, struck by a hammer padded to 9 millimeters of thickness, and you have another string, blah 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 dimensions, and the sound waves they produce overlap in just such a manner that the valley and the... When striking the human auditory organs, they are translated thus into a sound we call discordant. No, you communicate the truth of the experience by turning attention away from such things and describing it instead as sad, troubled, and uncertain. In fact, when watching an appropriate moment in film, the key change is the communication of these things. You can call it a language, but it's a more embodied language than the description of it, obviously. Music is a more phenomenological, less abstract language, like fighting or laughter or facial expressions or hugging. And the language that comes to us, that leaps out at us when describing the pinnacle of experience, is the religious language. Now, we're wary of terms like religion because they're obviously associated with institutions, liturgy, ritual, dogma, and blah, blah, blah. But this is not happenstance. It should be investigated and evolved, but it should also be respected. I'll use the term transcendent. It's not that the transcendent simply became tangled up with our institutions. It's that there's something about the transcendent that cannot exist only in the individual, isolated human. Like so many features of the human, it's intrinsically a collective, intersubjective thing. It's suspended in between us, just as our language must institutionalize and collectivize, just as our internet must, our child rearing, our law, our empathy. All of these things are dependent on this human mind, which is structured by the human biology, which is conducive to the survival of the human species. Earlier I said we've become a self-regarding sort of being. We've become a music-appreciating sort of being. In the same way, you could speculate that we've become a religion-experiencing sort of being. It's in us. It's in our structure. Oh, great. An hour on, and I've just reconcluded what I said in pretty much the very first paragraph. Nice. And even the infant already knows it. Part 8. The final question. Once the institution is stripped away, what does religion describe? Is it necessary? I don't know. I might say religion is the term we use to describe that element of our structure which is most non-reflective, to use Sartre's word. It's to cast off the self-regarding and to inhabit a role, an action, a body. Some of this is very intentional and indeed requires an intense regarding of one form. Taking part in a prayer, for example, or reciting a liturgy or making the sign of the cross. These things are meta-actions in the same domain as rational language or symbol. They're unique, however, because we are acting them out, supposedly, with the whole of our being. Rather than applying them as descriptions in relation to a further goal of self-regard, we're attempting to dismiss the ego entirely. The regarded goal is meant to consume us entirely in each passing moment. We're sort of immersing ourselves in symbol only, to first enter consciously into it, and then in forgetting ourselves, to make it somehow embodied.
How do you call the small desert mouse again?
Muad'Dib.
Muad'Dib.
No. Muad'Dib is wise in the ways of the desert. Muad'Dib creates his own water. The constellation that points to the North Star we call Muad'Dib, the one who points the way. That is a powerful name. Now you are our brother. Ol Muad'Dib Usul.
These acts are nested in a story we tell ourselves about being, about our place in it, about the nature of the transcendent which leaps out at us. So The entire process appeals to something greater than the self along, hopefully, every dimension. The narrative dimension, the dimension of knowledge, matter, discipline, goodness, mortality, and so on.
Jam is just water. We have thousands such places. When we have enough water, the Lisan al-Gaib will change the face of Arrakis. He will bring back the trees, he will bring back a green paradise.
To enter into the rituals properly is to be aware of and devoted to these stories, to act them out with recognition of the overarching place they hold, and then in the quiet of one's own mind to consider the nuances, the failings, the successes, every way in which the story touches upon your individual life. This is the manner in which we attempt to align our rational self, our linguistic self, with what can only be embodied. It is to make embodiment so meta, and then to devote ourselves to it so completely that it subsumes the domain of reason and provides a framework by which reason can be applied. It provides a framework by which we know which things to look at, which things to not even look at, which things to embrace, to reject, where to play the game of the poet or the creative leap, and so on. This is what an archetype is, and you might say it's the best tool we have for structuring this preconditional perception we have been discussing. You might say the archetypes go through their own natural selection. Results are those we embrace through faith. Now, is it necessary? I still don't know. Can it go wrong? Absolutely. And maybe there are parts of it that can only be tested, once again, by acting them out and seeing what comes. So that's one side of religion, the liturgical, the non-individual, the non-sensory. It's an attempt to frame the maximally abstract somehow closer to the embodied sort of being we inhabit. The other side is the highly sensory or individual side of the religious. This is more corporeally compelling, more undeniable, but also more unstructured. It does not lend itself to as much of an institution or single narrative, for it's discovered in precisely that point at which you turn away from regarding the symbol. This is the ayahuasca, the chanting in the drum circle. This is what the poets mean when they say it's religious to know a woman. This is when you are slain in the spirit or tremble or speak in tongues. This is when you access something in the subconscious most directly, and it compels you to act in a manner beyond description and beyond deliberation. These experiences can go wrong, obviously, and if we institutionalize them, they can go wrong. But they are also regularly reported as the most foundational experiences of our lives, and they are the experiences even the most skeptical of us seek endlessly to return to. Over history, we see a dialogue between the two poles of religion. Sometimes we're in an epoch of chaos and it institutionalizes. It grows rigid, provides structure for a time, but then it grows stagnant and oppressive. Then we see awakenings, like the Jesus movement, like the 60s in general, like any explosion of hedonism after long suppression, like the American Transcendentalists breaking away from Puritan stodginess, like the Dionysian mysteries in tension with the Apollonian approach of regarding the world objectively and describing it, like Sufism in response to rigidized Islam, like Hasidic Judaism, like the Romantic reaction to Enlightenment thought, like the Shramana traditions in response to rigid Hinduism, like Diogenes, like the Russian holy fools, like the Quakers, like Tibetan Buddhism. And then if they dominate, if they're naturally selected, I guess, they tend to push until they go too far, and then we reinstitutionalize, like the Tibetan Buddhism, Sufism, the entire Protestant revolution, and so on. They all reinstitutionalized. Everything is dialogue, everything is defined in process. With the recent strides in science, though, and especially digital, there seems to be an acceleration towards the rational. Maybe it's something about how just very meta our tools have become. We manipulate information in such an abstracted manner and in such unnatural quantities, we can't possibly rely on intuition. We're learning to not only doubt it, but to reject it when it comes to institutions. But then it manifests in all these explosive ways along these fault lines where technology distances us from our nature. We're addicted, depressed, anxious, but along unnatural lines. We can no longer believe the religions we think we constructed them, but it wasn't that really. It was this dialogue, this dance by which the structure that was in us was abstracted out and manipulated collectively, narratively, in the same manner as our logical tools. It led us to dogma, blindness, and we're wary, good, but we cannot deny the parts of it that are in us, that make us up. Especially digital and binary, they sort of reveal to us just how soulless the realm of information is. This is something the great minds of the past didn't have to confront. Descartes, Aristotle, even, Newton and the like, they were still able to assert kind of freely or casually that at the center of truth there was a God, a purpose, a spirit, a goodness independent of the human mind. The very essence of the phenomenological, the truth of meaning, was not dependent, as I have been suggesting, on this human sensory apparatus, on the finitude of this human transmutation system. Before we understood just how soulless natural law could be, just how static the connections are, we felt somehow more free to pin it on a living, breathing God which resonated much more with our own structure. There was less separation between spirit and science, less separation between metaphysics and physics. Essential Salts just released a video on alchemy which delves into this at good length. I'll link it below. My point, though, is that if we want to get back that certainty and to ground it in something we can believe, free of these institutions that we doubt so much, we will need to affirm the primacy of the phenomenological, the primacy of this above all else, and we will still need to explore, to dare, to play the poet's game. Otherwise, we stagnate. Part 9, a summary, and a teaser for Part 2. Big Part 2. So, to summarize, language must ground itself in something else, or else it describes nothing. For objective things, this can only be pure abstracts like symbol or tautology or grammar. These still remain meaningless, though, until they refer to something or appear in an embodied mind. For phenomenological things, language can ground itself in this embodied, directly known layer of being, experience. There's no other sort of ground to be discovered. There's no other place to which reason might refer itself, which is to say there's no other place to which truth or meaning might refer itself. As a side note, it seems to me that a pragmatist conception of truth is nested also in these processual terms. Truth cannot be described as any one thing without acknowledging the process by which it is engaged. Truth is sort of at the nexus of being an instrument we use, the discovery itself, the matter outside the phenomenological, then also matter in relation to the mind and what the mind cares about in this preconditional way. Truth is a sort of Kierkegaardian process synthesis, which if pursued brings goodness into being. Because of our sense structure, however, our brain wants to see the world as a landscape made up of static objects interacting. This is the sense structure we've evolved to help us survive, and our language evolved to reflect it. It therefore became very difficult to interrogate things that lie beneath that, because in the way of most animals, we historically did not need to. But then, suddenly, first we became human, then we learned to use symbols and regard things. Then the symbols brought easy manipulation and transmission of perception. Then easy manipulation and transmission of perception caused realization as to the world's perceptual nature. Then realization of the world's perceptual nature caused doubt. Then, especially now in the age of science, we became accustomed to dealing with our doubts via language and collective discussion, particularly critical or rational discussion. So, finally, we're doomed until we move beyond and embrace the spirit of the poet, or acknowledge the religious that is in us. Now, I know this phenomenological I want us to embrace is hardly a personal God, much less an institutional one. The most transcendent I've established seems to be something like the sensations of every passing moment, and some of them are very compelling and feel very connected to other moments, and we call those more transcendent, and some are less compelling and feel more fragmented, and we call those baser or lesser things, spirits, whatever. I'm not running from here all the way to Catholicism or God. This is my annoyance with some of Peterson's stuff, and certainly all of apologetics. I'm going to be releasing a video soon on the many issues with apologetics, so stay tuned. But yeah, they'll dance around in this very abstract, not what we recognize as religion space, and meanwhile be sort of winking to their audience that they're really talking about their good old religion, you know? Everyone in the club is sort of playing along and nodding, relieved to find their basic fundamentalist institution affirmed, even in the face of all these hoity-toity intellectuals, and yet they're not playing the same game. And look, okay, who knows how useful all this abstract intellectual rambling is? Maybe it's all just mental gymnastics. Is the embodied truth of this life better than the embodied truth of a dogmatic fundamentalist? Well, I would say yes. I mean, that's why I'm doing this. But it has its limitations. I'm certainly not going to do this forever. Certainly not only this. Sometime I'll have to figure out how the transcendent is embodied, and I'll have to go engage in that. This human-structured body that generates human-structured meaning, it requires rituals, community, actions of faith, not only intellectual dandruff, but the dogma, the institution, the corruption, the simplicity. It's just wrong. They just start defining God into being. That's the danger with Peterson's game, particularly as this bridge to more advanced whatever thinking. They start with this existentialist definition of the transcendent, or this Kalam-style need for a beginning to the cosmos, the unmoved mover, and then they cascade it down and down and down with all these leaps to things like the Bible being literally true, the Bible being divinely revealed, Jesus, resurrection, the church, and you get to this frustrating place where, to his critics, it feels like all Peterson is doing is sort of gesturing to the self-evident presence of Christianity, or gesturing to the fact that it dominates at least our Western paradigm, and he's sort of giving a deterministic shrug and saying, hey, it's what's here, it's our structure, man. And I don't want to do that. And he pretty much suggests that wherever it seems to contradict logic, like miraculous stories or whatever, we just have to accept that we aren't even asking the right questions or even standing in the right place. We don't even understand what it would mean for a text or a resurrection to be divinely, and so on. You know what I'm saying. Okay, now I know this video didn't get a ton into the actual meat of Peterson's views. I hardly even established what an archetype might be, much less dove into the Christian ones and whether they might be more or less useful than others, whatever. That'll be part 2, so keep your eyes peeled. The most I've tried to establish here is, yes, the need for phenomenological language and the observation that it must be more than any singular instance of sensation. It does tend toward a transcendent nature. When we describe it, we find ourselves in endless need of that sort of universal or overarching language. Any material object like this microphone obeys greater laws like gravity, which describe how this matter connects to all other matter. In the same way, it seems like an experience of momentary awe at music, say, speaks to a greater essence of music, or what it is to be this human structured being in relation to music. Now, of course, there are hosts of philosophers who reject this very thing. The appeal to universals or essences or spirit or whatever is a trick of the human mind or language. Dennett talks about everything as just particles, brain states, and we simply don't have the language to discuss it. But the truth of some of these things, spirit, say, being, seems harder to attack from this existentio-phenomenologist perspective, by which perception is the primary reality. It's matter that falls into a paradigm of infinite borders and quantities spread out on space-time. The trouble with abstraction like language describing matter is it falls into this paradigm of finite borders and quantities spread out on space-time, bumping around and causing things to be experienced chronologically. But experience, the essence of it, where is the finitude of music? Who can point to the boundary where this major chord becomes a minor? Because it's the actual transition, it's the actual being of the boundary that makes the experience. It's the actual process that gives the finite, rigid things their essence in transformation. So that's what we'll discuss further in part 2. We'll look at how this phenomenological realm seems to require ever more universal, ever more assertive, ever more ambitious language. And what's the deal with this particularly Christian language? Is it like all other symbols a distraction from embodied truth? Why does Peterson love it so much? And then we'll go even further. If the archetype reveals something in our structure, and if it exists primary to each momentary instantiation, the things most real will not be stories we tell about ourselves, because those are after all descriptions. No, the things most real will be the stories we live out. And this will lead us back to the beginning, where infants already are. Great. Great, Jesse. Life is an ongoing flow. Woohoo. Nice. Okay. Yeah.